Welcome, everybody. I am excited to be joined by Dan Esdale, Chief Marketing Officer of Encompass, formerly Lifelinks Class. Dan, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so Lifelinks Class merged. They waited 12 months. They rebranded. You've just completed the rebrand and launched the new brand. Kind of tell us about the journey and how things unfolded.
Yeah, it's amazing that timeline, right? It all happened really in the span of 12 to 15 months. And when you think about everything that's happened, in that time span, it's actually quite an incredible journey. I came on board post-merger, so I didn't have the perspective of being a staff member at Lifelinks Inc. or at Class Inc. In a lot of ways, that worked to my advantage in my role, the first ever Chief Marketing Officer of this newly merged entity. And a lot of other ways it worked against me because I didn't have some of that institutional knowledge that a lot of other folks had. So, going into this at the front end, knowing that I was going to be rebranding an agency, and when I say rebrand, I think a lot of times people think, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, brand being sort of your logo, and that's just so much more than that. And when I tell people that the responsibility I have is literally new naming convention and a new visual identity for an organization that has a combined history of 100 years of serving the most vulnerable populations in Greater Lawrence and Greater Lowell. That's a pretty big responsibility and something I took very seriously. So, I think that the fact that I had a I should say, very supportive group to work with, a collaborative group to work with. Our CEO, who I know Jean Phelps, really has been key to this. I mean, she positioned this before I even got there, that this is the direction that the agency is going. And bringing me in, I already had that sort of tailwind behind me in terms of all of the prep work that Jean had done to really set the tone for what this would be. So, really the journey started on my first day. The journey started with just straight immersion, just me getting to know everybody, getting to know the ins and outs of the agency. And, one thing I've learned throughout my career is this concept of marketing. And I think that in the nonprofit space, that concept's even more important than in the private sector because, you always have that perception as a marketer coming in, what other job could that have been? Right? Mm-hmm. What person-facing role could that have been instead of hiring this guy who's going to, do a brand? And you have to be cognizant of that. And I was very cognizant of that. And, sort of marketing my role and my team's role at the agency was kind of core to the front end of this journey. But, we did it right. We gathered input. We hired an agency partner in this. We gathered input from all of our stakeholders, including staff, including families and caregivers. We talked to sort of folks in the industry, whether they were sort of with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, consultants and vendors that had worked with us, influencers in the space, employers who we had worked with, because we really needed to get a sense of who we were as an organization and the perception of our organization before we could really even get this started. And we really focused on the brand story and the brand narrative. We focused not on a logo. We focused on shifting the perception of what this initiative really was. And this initiative ended up tying into so much more than marketing. This initiative really dovetailed into the culture of the merged agency. It really dovetailed into the strategic plan of this merged agency. And we had to take into account the business goals of the agency along with the vision and the mission of the agency to get where we were today. So to really be sitting here talking to you after launching, this new brand and really feeling the excitement around the brand launch is very gratifying. I wore my Encompass colors here, I got my purple shirt on today. So we're very excited.
that's awesome. And so you guys can see here the transformation in the logos from Lifelinks Inc. and Class Inc. to the bridge brand of Lifelinks Class, now to the new visual identity, Encompass Human Services. So, I mean, that alone is a major change in organizations. And, one of the things that I always tell, clients and working with them on mergers is that three of the biggest obstacles are brand, board, and leadership. Brand has a lot of emotion and a lot of history tied to it, and brand equity tied to it. And so switching names is no small undertaking and no small feat. Like, how was that, psychologically to go through? And, did your process mitigate some of that psychological factors, being more methodical about it?
So I couldn't agree with you more in terms of that. And yes, the short answer to your question is yes. I think in a lot of ways, initiatives like this fail because they're A, top down, and B, done in a vacuum, and C, looked at in a vacuum. Well, this name sounds cool, and we'll hire a designer and we'll put it out there. I mean, I even met with people throughout this process who said, "Oh, I'd love to send you some name. I have some ideas for names," and I would always laugh a little bit because it was never going to be the process. I wasn't going to open it up and solicit names and have almost a contest. But it was about priming the most engaged stakeholders, the most impacted folks, and that is sort of the community that is Lifelinks Class, now Encompass, priming them for what's to come, and really, for lack of a better term, selling them on this process, right? I think that one of the keys was really sort of demonstrating to them who we are as an agency. I think a lot of people...
When you say that, do you mean like, doing the investigation and being able to reiterate back
Correct.
to them in a very simplistic, like really focused way?
There were so many aha moments in the front end of this process, and exactly that way. Hearing perceptions of the organization from different audiences, but also just distilling that into a narrative where the descriptor, the naming convention, and the visual identity, the logo, the two things that you alluded to as these really hard things. It's a lot of work. It almost became the easiest part of this process, right? Wow. Because the real hard part of this process is before you even go down that road, right? So at the beginning of this process, we had people submitting names and offering to sketch out logos because they didn't look at this the way that I was looking at this, right? What we did was we focused on what I call the brand story, our brand narrative, which is something that I think most nonprofits in general don't do, right?
No, they don't have that.
We made a very conscious effort to focus on that on the front end and to define that brand story. And here's the thing. A brand story isn't just how you define yourself, it's how you're perceived, right? Out there in the world. And in a lot of ways, I think that when I did the audit of all the communications and marketing when I first got there, what I saw and what I see in sort of this human services space is a lot of service descriptions. I don't see a lot of storytelling. I don't see a lot of focus on the impact, and it's almost taken for granted in a lot of ways, right? So, we really set out to put an emphasis on the intrinsic motivations and the intrinsic benefits of being a part of this agency, and that in and of itself is very motivating to me as a marketer, to see people take pride in their work and know that there's such a great story here just waiting to be told. So if we had done this where we kind of skipped all that and said, you know what, I need a new name. We merged, I want a new name, I want a new logo, I'm gonna hire an agency, we're gonna, put some stuff, throw some stuff against the wall, see what sticks, we would not have been successful. And you would have had that sort of negative blowback. Now I say that knowing that there are people out there today who don't like the name and the logo. That's okay. There's no such thing as a perfect marketing and branding initiative, right? But they know
the story.
Exactly. And that's really the root of this is I'm okay because people having an emotional reaction is exactly the reaction I want from anything I put out into the market.
Okay. So you came from marketing at Harvard to marketing and being the chief marketing officer at Suffolk University to now the chief marketing officer at Encompass. Why is branding so vital in, let's just jump right to, forget the nonprofit space as a whole, because I think higher ed people get it. Why is it so important in health and human services?
Oh man, so branding is just one of the most important assets. The brand you have is one of the most important assets, whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in the public sector, whether you're in the nonprofit sector. You know, your brand is your most important intellectual property. And it's so important, especially in the nonprofit space, because, I mean, let's back it up, right? What is your brand? What are we even talking about here? Like, what is a brand? And, you know, you can Google it and, you know, get the marketing definition, but I'm going to give you sort of my simple definition of that. You know, your brand, a brand is the who and the why. Okay, so it's who you are and why you exist. You know, that's your brand, right? You have to nail that down and you have to get that right, because in terms of marketing activity and brand building activity, and you mentioned equity, you have to know who you are and how you're perceived in the market and how you want to be perceived if you're going to get an ROI on anything else. And like I said, you know, marketing in a lot of ways is looked at as a cost center, right? Not a revenue center. Sales is revenue center. Marketing is a cost center. But I actually look at it the opposite. You know, a good marketing campaign can just be rocket fuel, right? In terms of, even in the nonprofit space, right? In terms of engagements, a strong brand equates to strong reputation, which equates to a stronger influence. So in other words, for you to deliver on your mission, you need to have that influence and that strong reputation. So if you're not putting stock in your brand, you're doing it with one hand tied behind your back. But the other thing,
It's gotta be hard to define though, right? Like
yes.
it's like when you sit down and you're at a job interview and someone says, "Tell me about yourself," or you're
Mhm.
planning your 30-second elevator pitch. I mean, the amount of time that goes into a 30-second spiel out of your mouth is, you've probably spent days or weeks fine tuning and
Weeks.
honing,
Yeah.
because you're telling somebody about who you are,
Yeah.
in a really short snippet. That's incredibly hard to do.
And I'll tell you something I've learned in my career too. You don't create this, right? Any marketer says they create a brand is just lying to you. We don't create brands. We sculpt them, right? Your brand story is being told. It's being told out in the world, and in the world we live in now, where it's more interconnected than ever before.
Ever, yeah.
I think that is making this all the more important, right? So, I mean, you mentioned my background at Suffolk. Let me give you a quick example. When I started at Suffolk University, the marketing at Suffolk University was very traditional. So there's a term I sort of co-opted, if you will, when I was in higher ed from an agency I worked with called Three in a Tree, and basically what that referred to was, if you just close your eyes and picture any college brochure, right? I know your kids of the age now where they're
Yep.
thinking about school, right? Close your eyes and picture any college brochure, and I guarantee you that 90% of you are picturing a group of three people in a nice green background, a leafy quad with trees in bloom. We call that Three in a Tree marketing. And Suffolk is anything but Three in a Tree. Suffolk is a downtown institution. And shifting that perception took a year, because it's change management, change fatigue. These are all real things in my world. But what we did was we doubled down on who we are. We didn't shy away from who we were. We are a downtown Boston urban institution rooted in experiential learning. So we went from a mantra of our mantra was no three in a tree, and we went to one in a T, right? So our campus is Boston, right? So we would focus on one individual in front of a T station that kind of showed the connectivity that our campus had no borders, right? It was built to be boundless. That was our positioning statement. And let me tell you the thing about, you say it's hard to tell that 30-second spiel. I agree. And you know what? Nobody's going to remember it. But when you have your brand defined, your brand story defined, your job, not as a marketer, but your job is to empower people around you to relentlessly tell that story, because it doesn't work if it's not authentic to you. So one of the first things that we did when we started this process at Encompass, I got to get used to saying that out loud now. I've been keeping it under wraps for so long here.
I know. It's been top secret for 6 months. It's
exactly. I'm like, wait, I can say this now. Oh my goodness. But one of the first things we did was we set out to say, what is our unique value proposition? That's the number one question that every organization needs to ask themselves, right? What is your unique value proposition? What are you bringing to the market that your competitors are not? What are you doing better than your competitors? If you can really answer that question of your unique value proposition, your brand story is going to start coming to life. But you have to combine that with where you want to go, right? So at Encompass, I think the pandemic has really brought into focus the need to innovate. We have closed facility-based programs. Now we're at reduced capacity facility-based programs. What did this agency do? It innovated, right? We went from 0 virtual programs to 100 a week. And we did that in a matter of weeks. And I think that that's something that not every organization can do. So that becomes part and parcel to who we are. And we have our proof points in the market so that it's an authentic and genuine aspect of our unique value proposition.
So you talk about the pandemic, right? You've got your messaging dialed down, and then all of a sudden, poof, overnight, everything is virtual.
Yep.
Right. And what I don't think a lot of leaders across the nonprofit space, particularly in human services, which is where you are, understand now the opportunity in a digital landscape, right? But there's also a major threat because you're no longer doing things face to face. So your relevance is in a digital world. So like, how is that an opportunity, or what do we need to be thinking about? Because I mean, marketing plays the number one role in driving attention, eyeballs, or traffic to any one program service. And that could be on the funder side or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that now we're getting into marketing, right? So we've kind of talked about branding, and now we're kind of getting into marketing, which is the how, right? So branding's the who and the why, and marketing is the how. And, the simple fact is that, yes, the pandemic has been sort of very recent, sudden example of a, massive pivot here, right? From, facility-based to virtual, from, on-site clinical to telehealth. There's a lot that we've had to adapt on the fly, but the reality is, marketing itself is dynamic, right? So it's not just the product you have, it's the channels that you're using, right? So every year, you might have to reinvent your marketing strategy because that's just the pace of the world right now, right? So what I say is always, always put your audience first. And I think that's hard for people to do in the nonprofit world in a lot of ways because, we don't typically have like a big marketing department, right. And, folks kind of internalize things and they, talk to one another a lot. But if you can really put the focus on your audience, you're going to be better prepared to pivot when you need to pivot, right? So, for instance, what we did at what was then LifeLinks class when the pandemic started, knowing we were going to shift to virtual programming, knowing that we had this brand project going on, I chose not to hit the brakes on that. In a lot of ways, it would be easy to just, all right, let's hit the brakes on the brand project. Let's focus on our pandemic response. Can't do that. Your brand is your reputation, and now more than ever, you need to invest in your reputation, right? So we kept that train going. We didn't put the brakes on that, but we did pivot. So we restructured our website so that it focused more on that virtual program offering that we had never had before. We restructured our communication strategy because now it's not just the opportunities. You have to literally talk about what these virtual programs are.
Right.
People just don't know, right? And what's the benefit of those virtual programs, right? And then you also had to pivot because there's the reality of information sharing around COVID-19 and sort of the coronavirus and the infection control and containment procedures that we had put into place. So right away, Gene Phelps said, day one, we formed a coronavirus task force back in February, and day one, she said, transparency is key. We are going to be transparent with our stakeholders, with our families, our caregivers, our individuals, and we've stayed true to that, right? So every Friday, an email goes out to the entire sort of staff that has the COVID numbers, all the latest information. So again, it's put yourself in your audience's shoes. And in marketing, it's always test and iterate, test and iterate, test and iterate, right? So the product's there, and then the how is, how do you market, how do you get that product in the hands of a new consumer and compel them to engage with it, right? And I think that's when you get into this concept of conversion rate optimization and digital marketing, and that gets into a whole other level of sophistication.
Wow. Okay, so when you talk about branding, we're talking about the who and the identity. The marketing is the tactics and the how.
Yes.
Right? But the marketing, I mean, it can get pretty involved, in terms of, data, metrics, systems, and things like that.
Yep.
I think a lot of times, when we look at some of these mid to large size agencies, that level of sophistication is new in terms of what the capabilities actually are that are out there.
And I think in a lot of ways it's intimidating.
Yeah.
And my 2 cents with that is, don't be afraid, right? And the risk here is low. So test and learn. So it's impossible to stay on top of this if you're not 1000% focused on it, right? So big consumer brands have individuals dedicated to not digital. I mean, when people say digital marketing, I kind of chuckle, right? Because now everything, the term marketing technologist is
everything
a thing.
Is digital.
You got it. I mean, this is specific swatches of digital marketing. Like somebody might be focused strictly on an AI chatbot that's aimed at converting inquiries into product sales, right? We're not going to do that in the nonprofit landscape. However, you can start it right now. I mean, there's no reason that you cannot, go on to Facebook and boost a post. It's actually not that difficult. And, if there's resources out there. So like LinkedIn Learning has, I know your son's done LinkedIn Learning. It's a wonderful digital marketing foundational course, but if you want to just focus in on one channel and you're in the nonprofit space, Facebook's your channel, all right? That is the number one channel you should be focused on. And you can do so much, like a quick little hack I'll give you right now, and I'm going to watch how you distribute this video, Eric. Think about social media platforms. They're businesses. They want to keep you on that platform. I can't tell you how many people I see post a YouTube video to Facebook.
Oh boy.
That kills you.
You're killing me.
It kills you. Because Facebook wants you to use Facebook Watch. So if you're putting a YouTube video, you're linking people away from the Facebook platform. So it's a little more work, right? But if you are working within those native platforms, you're going to get a bigger boost and you're going to see a bigger ROI from this. So just my advice to people is always just try it. You have nothing to lose, and don't be intimidated. You're not going to do a comprehensive, programmatic ad buy that has geo-fencing, IP geo-targeting campaigns. Like, could you do that? Absolutely. I mean, when I was at Harvard at the Kennedy School, I would serve ads to anybody who walked into a government building. I mean, that's the level of sophistication you can get to right now. But that is also requires a certain skill set and level of expertise. Mm-hmm. But you have to have a foundation to build off of, right? So don't try to go right into the deep end. Focus on Facebook. Focus on some of the Facebook hacks that are out there. There's so much content out there. There's so many groups out there. Join a group. Get engaged in the conversation. And remember this is also very important, especially from the nonprofiters world. People hate being marketed to, okay? If you go into a group, into a Facebook group, and you just drop sign up for my webinar, you're going to get ignored. This is a long-term play here. Okay. So what you're trying to do is get in the conversation. This is thought leadership, right? You're trying to add value to a conversation and build yourself up over time, because at the optimal time, you can ask somebody to sign up for your webinar, right? So these are like little tactics that you can use that, really you can do tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a tactical recommendation, or a hack, as you call it, right? And so if we kick things back up to the strategy level, and you're looking at, because the pace of mergers is picking up like crazy, same with affiliations and things of that nature, just out of, that was the trend before COVID, and then COVID kind of, exponentially kicked it in the butt. What would you, tell CEOs or chief marketing officers in the health and human services sector, or maybe even beyond, to start thinking about over the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, I think it's you kind of mentioned sort of in terms of the three roadblocks to a merger, and from my perspective, the things I would really add to that are culture and technology. When you're talking about, like, I'll just use our example here, right? I came in post-merger, but Lifelinks and Class, when they merged, Gene, as the CEO of the new Lifelinks Class entity, put a huge focus on culture, like, right away. So before I even walked in the door, she had a culture task force already put together, and that task force was immensely valuable to me. And the irony of this process is the marketing discovery actually was cultural discovery as well. And what came out of that is the term that we've been using for the past few months, care champions. We when I got there, we call the folks who work directly with the individuals that we serve direct support professionals. That just doesn't sound very
sum it up either,
right? They are care champions. They, in this pandemic, you mentioned everything's gotten thrown out of whack in the past few months with this pandemic, but you know what? The folks who are out in the community still are out in the community. We still had folks in those group homes, and they were champions for the people that they serve. And we just really weren't telling that story very effectively. And if you can really focus on culture, I mean, that old term, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? But if you have a vision as a CEO for growth, and that growth is rooted in M&A, you're going to have to build a strong culture, and you're going to start doing that now. And it has to be, again, like the brand, authentic, not just to where you are, but where you're going. And like I said, with our firm, innovation has been the pivot for us, right? So our brand position in all this is innovating to help the most vulnerable thrive, right? So a lot of people see the tagline, the creative through line that's out there, with open hearts, we open doors. But everything really tied together here, right? So the mark of that open heart was rooted in the brand story, where we honed in on the history we have of open hearts. And then you dig deeper and you start saying, well, that's really a cultural learning, that's rooted in the people who work at Lifelinks Class. And we need to really express that. And not only that, as a marketer and as a CEO of a nonprofit, your employees are the best brand ambassadors you have. You have an entire network that you can simply activate, but you have to do it methodically. You have to have a real clear vision of culture, and you have to effectively communicate that. The other side of it is technology. I call it the marketing technology stack, but it's the enterprise architecture, right? It's the tech stack. So, when you're growing and you're bringing organizations together, one of the things that you really need to be mindful of is this concept, really, of data-driven decision-making. You have to have a good sense of the impacts in real time now of decisions that you're making. So much like a marketing campaign, I want to know. So I just sent out an email from our CEO that was a video, right? And I know that 50% of those folks who received this email opened it, which is a phenomenal open rate. And you might be laughing, thinking, like,
no, that is huge.
But this is, and the reality is that email marketing, I know a lot of people say, oh, email marketing's dead. It's not dead. It is not dead. It is for sure not dead. But because we have, you have a CRM, you have an enterprise architecture, it's a way for us to quickly react to really convert people, whether they are donors on the fundraising side, whether they're potential new individuals that we can support or families that we can support, or it's just information, right? At the end of the day, we're all about thought leadership. So if more and more people are reaching out to us with more and more challenges, we need to know that as an organization so that we can grow our service portfolio to meet demand. I don't want to have to create demand, right? I want to fill demand. And I think, going back to my time in higher ed, very, very similar. Higher ed launches all these new academic programs. In a lot of ways, the catalyst for it is the expertise that you might have on campus in terms of your faculty. And I can tell you one of the, less fun conversations I've had in my career was telling a Harvard Kennedy School faculty member that, hey, you might be the foremost expert in the world when it comes to microfinance in developing countries, because you are, and your resume speaks for itself, but there isn't a market for that, right? I cannot market that and make it something that we can make work financially speaking. So I think having that technology stack and being able to let the data kind of tell that story for you is so important. And I think it's probably something that's underutilized in the nonprofit world.
Oh, that's a really good example of leveraging data in decision making. And so, you guys have just launched the brand, right? So what's next for the brand strategy for Incompass, or the marketing strategy, or just whatever it is you're working on? What are the next steps after you launch a brand?
So there's 3 next steps: content. All right.
Preaching to the choir, man.
Those are our 3 next steps. 1000%. It's telling our story, right? So the visual identity, the naming convention, we've released those, but we have a lot of work to do to effectively tell our story to the people that we want to reach. So content, right? So we have a marketing committee that we formed where, we're sort of I call it, in terms of the content strategy, I look at it as a multi-phrased approach. So it's curation, creation, presentation, distribution, optimization, okay? We have to find those stories first and foremost. And when we find them, we have to package them in a way that's going to speak to our audience. And we have to know who that audience is to do this effectively. And we have to have ways to reach that audience vis-a-vis whether it's email marketing, native advertising, strictly word of mouth. And, we have to measure that and optimize that going forward, right? What's really resonating, and let's go all in on that. So content, and not just long form written content. I'm not talking about press releases and corporate, so to speak, and news stories. I'm talking about creating an emotional connection. I'm talking about showing the impact of our work and relentlessly focusing on that. And there's a term I use in my sphere here: momentum begets momentum. You have to find a few champions of this. And once you do, and you start putting those stories out into the world, and you start showing engagement with that content, all of a sudden more people are going to come to you. And then your biggest problem isn't curating, right? It's sort of a process around operationalizing what are we going to be able to allocate resources towards. But content nowadays, like I said, it doesn't just mean written long form content. Podcasts, videos like we're doing right now, Facebook Live. There's so many different rich media out there that we can take advantage of that will give us instant reach. So right now, our focus is unabashedly on content and effectively telling our brand story.
That's fantastic. I mean, that really sums it up. I think content's been a really great strategy because, one, it's a way to communicate those stories, but it's a way to have more out there in the world to be found.
Absolutely.
So I always like to ask, and kind of wrapping up the interviews, a little bit about you. What has been your biggest learning lesson in 2020? I mean, this is this has been the year of disaster. It's been the year of like
Mhm.
massive opportunity, massive disruption. What have been your biggest learning lessons?
So I kind of mentioned this before in terms of marketing, but one of the sort of things I've thought a lot about in terms of reflecting on these past 6 months is how important it was for in my first 6 months to build the relationships that I built internally. Because you can see behind me, I'm working remotely. For the most part, I have been since March, but I'm still very engaged with the organization, every day. We're on Zoom right now. People talk about Zoom fatigue, but I've been able to stay connected because I built those relationships, and
Right.
because we focused on sort of getting myself and Amaris, who's the other member of the marketing team here, very visible within the organization. So building those relationships is so important. People always talk about networking, but it's relationship building really that it's all about. And I think the other thing is sort of empathy. Understanding sort of your audience. We talk about the pandemic, and in a lot of ways you kind of default back to how it impacts your business or your organization. But we've lost almost 200,000 lives as of today. There are people in our network, whose lives were cut short, by this deadly disease. So I think just the respect that I have for the people that I work with who are in the community, and just putting the most vulnerable population, the people that they're serving, putting them, sort of front and center. It's motivating. It's inspiring. And I want to tell that story. They are care champions, and, I want to tell that story. And I think lastly, it's just, again, the importance of having a robust technology platform. Everything's kind of remote, but making sure that we've had to engage a whole new audience, and we've had to do it on the fly. And, we had to do a lot of things differently that we weren't planning to do. And, looking back, if I had a really robust CRM at the time, it would have been a lot easier for us. And the opportunity cost wouldn't have been so high. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think that the biggest thing I have learned is just sort of that value, if you will, of getting to know the folks I work with, getting to know the folks that I work for, i.e. our stakeholders, and keeping them top of mind.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and sharing your experience and journey with Encompass. So thank you.
No, thanks for having me. And honestly, this has been great discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a lot of ideas going in my head.
I'm sure I'll be hearing from you.
But if you want to learn more about Encompass, or the great work that Dan is doing on the marketing side of the house over there, please click the link below. If you want to hear from great leaders like Dan, please subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.
Thanks, everybody.